Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Subcommittee on Government Operations hearing this morning. The title of today's hearing is Mixed Signals, the Administration's Policy on Marijuana. And this is actually the fourth hearing that we've conducted on the issue of changes in policies between the state, federal, and local government on marijuana. And today we're going to focus on the health effects and science. We've done several other hearings. One focused, I think, the most recently on the district's change, and we have a unique relationship the Congress does with the District of Columbia on the legalization and decriminalization issue, change in their law. We did two other hearings, one with the Office of ONDCP, and some of it was prompted by the President and the Administration's statements that we've heard over the past few months. Then I think the other hearing that we did was looking at changes in state laws. This subcommittee deals with issues, federal issues and laws, sometimes that end up in conflict. That's one of our responsibilities in the subcommittee, is sorting out the differences between the different levels of jurisdiction in the federal government. As I said, this is our fourth hearing. I'll announce two in mid-July, and we'll settle on a date with the minority. We're going to do a fifth hearing, and that one will look at, I call it trains, planes, automobiles, and marijuana. There are a number of issues in conflict relating to transportation safety, and we do want to examine carefully where we're headed there as far as federal laws, conflict, and again, some of the changes in state statutes relating to marijuana use. The order of business will be, I'll start with an opening statement, then I'll yield to other members. And today we have one panel of witnesses, and we welcome them. We'll introduce them shortly. And after we hear from those witnesses, we'll go to a series of questions. We may be joined by other members of Congress. Starting off a little early this morning, some of them I heard will be with us, and we'll give them the opportunity to participate through a unanimous consent agreement. So with that, we'll begin the hearing, and let me just state again, we've heard different testimony about, again, conflict between state and federal law, changes in the law, and some societal changes and attitude towards the legalization question. Part of the hearing is prompted by what we've learned about the state of chaos that exists now between some of the administration's actions and their policy. The focus today is going to really look at the science of the issue, but we also are concerned about sort of the jumbled messaging about marijuana's effect on public health, and also science involved in classifying marijuana as a Schedule I drug. That issue has come up several times during these past hearings. Part of this was all initiated by the President's own statements, and I think some of that contributed and has contributed to some of the confusion. I've got the President's statement. In January, President Obama gave an interview about marijuana, describing marijuana as a bad habit and not very different from cigarettes. And he also added in his statement, again, don't take any or take any additional words or add any words to what he said, but he said, I don't think it's more dangerous than alcohol. And part of what we'll hear today is, again, sorting out the science of marijuana and its use and its effect as a health and safety issue. However, in our first hearing that we heard from the Deputy Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and his testimony, as you may recall, differed from that of the President. He first of all told the committee and testified that marijuana's potency has tripled over the past 30 years. And actually, this is a very good article, and I'm going to probably ask that we put this as part of the record without objection. And it just came out June 4th. It's the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's entitled The Adverse Effects of Marijuana Use. But this report, the scientific report, differs with what the President has said. And actually, if you look at this chart, you can see, and that's also published from this scientific journal, that in fact the potency has tripled over the past 30 years. So in fact, what was testified by ONDCP, in fact, is true, that you have some much more potent marijuana on the streets and in the marketplace today. They also testified to us that long-term marijuana use when begun during adolescence is associated with an average 8-point lower IQ in later life. And again, the Journal of New England Medicine cites again some of the impact on the brain and its impact particularly on adolescents in that regard. I was quite taken aback when I heard the Deputy Director of ONDCP testify to us about its effects. Again, more potent, and it does have some serious implications on the mental capacity of our youth. The other thing, I don't know if we had it on that chart or not, is the increased use. Have we got that chart? I know it's in this report, but it does show marijuana. Put that chart up again. The lower part of it shows marijuana. You've seen some pretty dramatic increases in the youth from 2008 to 2007. Also, unfortunately, cocaine, also heroin. So we have higher use of drugs and also higher incidence of abuse problems cited in this report. The National Institute, well, first of all, let me also take one other statistic before I finish my opening statement from this report. This report indicates that 2.7 million Americans are dependent on marijuana, and that we have approximately 9% of the users who become addicted to marijuana. Again, from the report, everybody seems to be chiming in today. On the way in, one of my staffers said that Pope Francis had also actually today issued a statement, and here's a copy of that. He told delegates attending a Rome Drug Enforcement Conference that even limited steps to legalize recreational drugs are not only highly questionable from a legislative standpoint, but they fail to produce the desired effects. And he went on to say it's only a veiled means of surrendering to the phenomenon. Let me state in the clearest possible terms, the problem of drug use is not solved with drugs. So we've got a lot of folks weighing in on their opinion. And again, the purpose of this hearing is to look at the science of the use of marijuana. The National Institute of Drug Abuse is tasked with studying drug abuse and addiction and other health effects. We're going to hear from representatives there today. NIDA has found that marijuana use has negative effects on the brain, particularly, again, as also mentioned in this journal study, the developing brains of our adolescents. Research shows that adults that smoke marijuana during adolescence have impairment in key brain regions associated with alertness, self-consciousness, awareness, memory, and learning. The Food and Drug Administration, which assists in establishing, they counsel on establishing drug scheduling. And again, the question has come up that marijuana continues to be listed as a Schedule I drug. But the FDA has found that marijuana has no accepted medical use. Again, their findings and reports. We'll hear more about that hopefully today. Regardless, some 20 states, and again, driving in today, well, no, I think that was shaving. Driving, I heard the Pope. Shaving, I heard that I think New York may be today the 23rd state to legalize marijuana for medical use. And in addition, we have Colorado and Washington. States have legalized marijuana for recreational use. You may recall we brought in the U.S. Attorney from Colorado to look at the issues and conflict between state and federal law and enforcement and prosecution. These states' actions do not change the fact that marijuana still remains illegal under federal law. Officials from the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse insist that marijuana remains a health risk and should not be made legal. However, officials from the Department of Justice issued guidance that explicitly declines to enforce federal marijuana laws in states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use, and have even issued guidance allowing federally regulated banks about dealing in dollars and money obtained through, unfortunately, illegal marijuana businesses that have sprung up. The President, Federal law enforcement, DEA, U.S. attorneys, Food and Drug Administrations, National Institute for Drug Abuse, we've heard a whole host of differing messages. Last year, DEA Administrator Michael Lenhart affirmed that mixed messaging can be harmful by stating the mixed messages being sent to America's teens and our young people about harmfulness and legality of using record high-potency marijuana are sometimes obscuring kids' awareness of the effects that the use of marijuana would have on them. I think America owes it to its children, its young people, to give them the best possible start to life. Also, responsible message from all of the various jurisdictions, responsible legal jurisdiction, so that they and society aren't hindered in the future. Today, we'll hear from two distinguished government witnesses, and then we also have a third witness who joins us from Columbia University. I look forward to a discussion about how mixed messaging from the administration affects drug abuse prevention and treatment, and the process of, we'll also discuss the process of classifying drugs as a Schedule I narcotic. Today, I hope we can separate fact from fictions. Mr. Conley, I met with my staff yesterday, and we were talking about what this hearing would be about. And I told them this is going to be like the old television series, law enforcement series. You had Jack Webb, you're old enough to remember, who said he'd go in and say, "All I want is the facts, just the facts, ma'am." And the startling thing
I'm really
was
not, I'm
wait.
really not old enough to
Yeah,
remember that. I just remember hearing
Don't
about
give me
it.
that, Mr. Conley. But my point is that none of the staff had heard that phrase or had heard of Jack Webb and that series. So, Dragnet, I guess, was the name of the series. But that's really our purpose here is all we want are the facts, and that's what we're going to deal with, hopefully, in this and future sessions. So with that, Mr. Conley, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this fourth in a series of hearings to examine today the scientific perspective on scheduling of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act. I must say, in this examination, what's going to be revealed is that we have some of the most restrictive guidelines in terms of research, all skewed toward outcomes that talk about the harmful effects of marijuana, almost none of which talk about the beneficial effects, potentially, the positive health effects of marijuana, because we don't allow the research. And we have one agency that severely restricts, for researchers, access to marijuana in a way that's almost unique to marijuana. In fact, we don't do that with other controlled substances, but we're going to examine that today. I think the hearing of this, the title of this hearing shouldn't be about this administration. It really is, almost 40 years of U.S. drug policy with respect to marijuana through Republican and Democratic administrations. Today, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, 22 states and the District of Columbia have actually departed from Federal policy and now have laws on the books that allow for some medical use of marijuana. Since 1970, the Federal Government has classified marijuana alongside heroin, LSD, and ecstasy as a Schedule I drug for which there is, quote, no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. That's interesting. That's quite an interesting message to the 22 states and the District of Columbia who have respectfully decided otherwise. In addition to constituting one of, quote, the most dangerous drugs of all the drug schedules with potentially severe psychological and physical dependence. That's an astounding statement. And it will be very interesting whether that holds up in terms of science. Now, I'm neither a doctor nor a scientist. Neither is the Pope, I might add. But I surely am not alone in raising my eyebrows over a classification system that would not only group marijuana among heroin, LSD, and ecstasy in terms of danger for abuse, but would rank cocaine, OxyContin, and methamphetamines as less dangerous, with less potential for abuse than marijuana. Is that science? In recent years, there's been a growing acceptance of the potential benefits for medicinal marijuana. Last year, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, a staff neurosurgeon at Emory Clinic and CNN's chief medical correspondent, penned an op-ed in support of medical marijuana, and I would ask that his full statement be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. In which he stated, quote, we have been terribly and systematically misled for nearly 70 years in this country, and I apologize for my own role in it. He noted, while investigating, I realized something else quite important. Medical marijuana is not new, and the medical community has been writing about it for a long time. There were, in fact, hundreds of journal articles, mostly documenting the benefits. Most of those papers, however, were written between the years 1840 and 1930. And in part, it's because we created a system limiting research to skew the outcome, so that we downplayed the positive benefits and highlighted the harmful effects. Meanwhile, on April 28, 2014, my Republican colleague and fellow Virginian, Morgan Griffith, hardly a liberal Democrat, introduced H.R. 4498, the Legitimate Use of Medicinal Marijuana Act, which would reclassify marijuana as a Schedule II drug. Currently, practitioners that are registered with DEA and have HHS approval may only obtain marijuana for approved research through one single entity, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA. NIDA acts as the single official source through which researchers may obtain marijuana for research purposes, and it's estimated that more than 90% of the marijuana research NIDA approves is to only examine the harmful effects of cannabis. That skews research. Regrettably, the more I learn about the process, the more I feel we may be trapped in a catch-22, another reference to an older era, Mr. Chairman, that would make Joseph Heller proud. As one nonprofit organization noted, DEA and NIDA have successfully created a catch-22 for patients, doctors, and scientists by denying that marijuana is a medicine because it is not FDA approved, while simultaneously, of course, obstructing the very research that might be required for FDA approval. Indeed, in a 2007 ruling that found allowing private production of cannabis for research purposes was in the public interest, a DEA administrative law judge stated, and I quote, "NIDA's system for evaluating requests for marijuana research has resulted in some researchers who hold DEA registrations and the requisite approval from the Department of Health and Human Services being unable to conduct their research because NIDA has refused to provide them with marijuana." Again, skewing research. If this is about science, then let the scientists and the researchers have at it, and let's see what they come up with. But if in advance you prevent them from having the very means to do that research, well, how can any of us be surprised at the outcome? Thus, as it stands today, on the one hand, we have the Federal Government that for more than 4 decades, not just this administration, Mr. Chairman, has insisted on placing marijuana under the most restrictive drug schedule possible, impeding scientific research into the drug's potential benefits. And that's one of the reasons, I guess, 22 states in the District of Columbia and maybe a 23rd state have rebelled against this heavy-handed Federal approach. On the other hand, we have very compelling anecdotal evidence and some emergent science that indicates cannabis may well have medicinal properties that can benefit individuals with certain conditions, such as individuals experiencing severe epileptic seizures or veterans suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome. And in the middle stand policymakers, such as myself, who would love nothing more than to carefully examine and review the evidence, but find ourselves facing an astonishingly barren research environment by design. It is time for our nation to approach the debate over marijuana policy with more honesty and less hyperbole and more science. It's a disservice to public discourse when policymakers refuse to grapple with challenging and complex issues in an objective and open manner. We can't ignore the growing evidence of families whose lives have been positively impacted by medicinal marijuana. For example, one of my constituents in Northern Virginia, Ms. Beth Collins, has watched her daughter suffer for years with severe epilepsy. This horrible disease has caused Ms. Collins' teenage daughter, Jennifer, to experience multiple seizures, at times more than 300 seizures in a single day. For years, the Collins family tried everything. They tried multiple medication regimes, all of which wrought painful side effects to their daughter, and none of which were efficacious in treating her symptoms. Today, Jennifer's seizures have dramatically dissipated by 85 to 90%. That's the good news. The bad news is that Jennifer was forced to leave Fairfax County and move to Colorado Springs because the treatment that has proven quite effective, a daily dose of medicinal marijuana oil from a syringe, not smoking joints, cannot be legally purchased in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Our nation can't continue to ignore compelling stories like that of the Collins family and so many others. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I would also ask unanimous consent. I have a series of letters and pieces of testimony from families attesting to the beneficial effects of medicinal marijuana for their medical conditions.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair.
Record.
And I'm almost done. I recognize that anecdote must be reinforced with rigorous scientific data. That's why I believe we should act swiftly to reclassify marijuana in order to allow for legitimate medicinal uses and research and enable rigorous scientific research that will provide a better understanding of how marijuana may be used, if proper. I've long believed that the Federal Government governs best when it truly listens and learns from our States, which have been for decades called the laboratories of democracy. They want their local governments to have the opportunity to innovate and experiment with regulatory and enforcement frameworks governing medicinal marijuana research and use. And I believe it is in our national interest to let those ongoing laboratories of democracy proceed, and to proceed within a rational Federal framework, one which I do not believe exists today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your opening statement. And Mr. Turner has left. We have 3 members who would like, and Mr. Connolly moves that.
Mr. Chairman, I do.
Unanimous consent that our colleague from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, our colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, and our colleague from Louisiana, Dr. Fleming, be allowed to participate in today's hearing.
I so move, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Mr. Chairman, just one other thing, a unanimous consent request. Very compelling testimony, and I commend it to you and my colleagues from my constituent, Beth Collins, on their story, and I'd ask that that be entered fully into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the Chair.
Now, let's see. We heard from Mr. Connolly, Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel for allowing me to be here today and welcome the panel. Yes, the medicinalization, the decriminalization, and the legalization of marijuana has been sweeping the nation, but it's been happening as a result of mythology about marijuana. And I just want to touch on those from the book from Kevin Sabat, a Ph.D. and an expert on the subject. Myth number 1, marijuana is harmless and non-addictive. That's simply not true. It's a complete myth. The most common diagnosis today for young people into drug and alcohol centers is for marijuana addiction. It does have a recognized withdrawal syndrome. Myth number 2, countless people are behind bars simply for smoking marijuana. Not true. Yes, there are a lot of people behind bars who smoke marijuana, but that's not why they're behind bars. They're either behind bars for dealing or involved in violence or theft or some other crime. The legality of alcohol and tobacco strengthens the case for legal marijuana. Terrible myth. If we have problems with tobacco and marijuana, why do we want to, tobacco and alcohol, why do we want to add a third problematic substance of addiction and create even more problems in our society? It makes no sense whatsoever. Also a myth, legal marijuana will solve the government's budgetary problems. The outcomes in terms of health problems, the outcomes in terms of government dependency when people can't get or maintain a job will cost governments a huge amount of money. We'll see our welfare rolls, our Medicaid rolls, and other things will skyrocket. Another myth, a common myth, Portugal and Holland provide successful models of legalization. First of all, smoking pot there is not legal. It's decriminalized, not legal. And in recent years, they've begun to turn back the time, turn back the clock on the steps of liberalization of that use. Prevention, intervention, and treatment are doomed to fail. Not true at all. Wherever we see that there's prevention, wherever we see that there's intervention, we see lower use. And in fact, we talked yesterday in the Addiction Caucus, where as there's liberalization of thought, where there's less threat to use, we see the use go up and all the other problems that go with it, addiction, drug driving, accidents, deaths from accidents, etc. Now let's talk about medicinal use, and Mr. Connolly suggests that we just haven't been studying that. Well, I beg to disagree, because my university that I graduated from, the University of Mississippi, both undergraduate and as a physician, this has been studied there in their pharmacology department for 40 years. And the reason why you're not hearing about all of the great things that come from marijuana is they're not finding good things coming from marijuana. The only thing they can find is the harm. Now, there's a discussion about seizures. I have raked across the literature on this. I can't find any authority on this, whether it's rare seizure disorders or common ones, where marijuana is used as a treatment, where it's a recognized use. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but it's a Schedule I drug. Well, actually, no. There is a Schedule III drug called Marinol, which is actually an oral form of marijuana. And it is used, and it can be used at the same equivalency as, say, Lortab or OxyContin or a drug like that that's used in more common everyday medical use. So you see, it's been there and can be used, and there's a discussion about, well, maybe the oil that doesn't include THC can be used for seizure disorders. Well, sure, that's an extract, and I'm sure we would be able to make that a safely used drug, but no one's been able to prove that the use of marijuana oil has any real benefit. Yeah, we hear the anecdotal stories, but that's how the myths come out, is someone tells a story and they tell someone else, and before you know, it's been blown completely out of proportion. And then lastly, something of which I've studied for years and wrote a book on in 2007, is the fact that we know the earlier in life that the human brain is exposed to addicting substances, again, realizing that the human brain does not mature until age 25 to 30. That's right, half this room have immature brains today. And as a result, if you...
Would my colleague want to tell us which half?
Don't get me started, sir. But if you look at the fact that the average age of first use of alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana is 10 years old, then you find that the pathway, the building of the reward system towards addiction begins very early in life. And so when you diagnose someone with an addiction at age 25 or 30, they've been in that process for a decade. And so as we legalize, decriminalize, or otherwise medicinalize marijuana, that means more and more marijuana will be available to young people, and they will use it. And we're already finding this, looking at California and Colorado, places where this process has been going on. So I would say to my colleagues today that I look forward to hearing from our panel. But as we study marijuana, all we find is bad news. More heart disease, more lung disease, higher rates of schizophrenia, and many other problems, all apart from addiction, which of course is a problem. And I'll end with this. The other myth is that not only is marijuana non-addictive, but it's not a gateway drug. And I'll tell you what a drug addict told me. He said, "Doctor, every addicting substance is a gateway drug, and marijuana is no exception to that." Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and let me see seniority. Mr. Blumenauer, thank you for joining us. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Mica, I appreciate your ongoing efforts to sort of peel back the level of the onion with these hearings. Your courtesy in permitting us to join in, to follow the information, and it's certainly timely, and you've highlighted some areas of contradiction, and in this area, I think today's hearing is one that hopefully we can all agree there needs to be some progress. I appreciate Dr. Fleming not talking about which half of the brain are immature. I think it may not always deal with chronology or early substance abuse, but I appreciate the benefit of the doubt. I also appreciate, I think he used the phrase 3 times in his opening statement, that no one has been able to prove, and then had a clause after that. And I think that's exactly the case. And that is why this is such an important hearing. It's because when we have 1 million people in the United States who are currently using medical marijuana legally under the laws of the 22, it looks like it's going to be 23 states now in the state of New York and the District of Columbia. And then there are other states that are dealing with variations on this. It's inexcusable that we don't have better information. I'm embarrassed for this administration and previous administrations for not having a robust, effective program to be able to deal with the facts. I'm embarrassed when I'm at OHSU dealing with neuroscientists and physicians who are talking about patients that they have, similar to what Mr. Conley was talking about, who are having very positive results. And it is harder for those scientists and doctors to get marijuana to research than it is for parents to self-medicate the kids and really not knowing what they're being given. And part of that is the fault of the Federal Government and stupid policies. I would note for the record, Mr. Chairman, and ask respectfully that I could enter into the committee's record a letter dated June 17th, a bipartisan letter signed by 30 members of Congress to Secretary Burwell urging that there be changes in the research protocol.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It points out in the letter that only with marijuana and no other Schedule I substance is there an additional Public Health Service review for non-NIH funded protocols established in May 21st, 1999 in the Guidance for Procedures for Provision of Marijuana for Medical Research. We've got examples as well of people who are jumping through procedural hoops, people who are approved for research, and we've got this little narrow spigot that does not work. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed for you having to be here to defend a broken system. I'm embarrassed that we, after years and years and years, and as the states are moving ahead of us, the Federal Government is not an effective partner to be able to have the information. Now, Dr. Fleming and I have modestly different views about what a sustainable marijuana policy should be. But we're absolutely in accord that we shouldn't be guessing, that we should have facts, we should have effective research. It should work for the American people. And I, Mr. Chairman, appreciate the courtesy of being able to join. I will be monitoring this. I'm bouncing back and forth between a Ways and Means hearing. I'm going to be here as much as I can. But I really think this is critically important. I appreciate you doing it and you and the ranking member allowing us to participate.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. Let me recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I appreciate your having the hearing and your allowing those that are not on the committee but have an interest in the subject to participate. First, I want to compliment Dr. Hart for maintaining his demeanor during some of the statements that have been made. Rather amazing ability to withhold. My colleague from Louisiana talks about marijuana and says there's been nothing found beneficial. Of course, we know that's not true because the people with epileptic seizures, the mothers who have found that part of that, the cannabinoids or whatever it is, it definitely helps their children. There's no question about that, and states are kind of falling over themselves now, even Tennessee, to study that in Mississippi because kids are having their seizures reduced, which shows that the whole idea of it being Schedule I and having no accepted medical benefit is wrong because these kids are benefiting from it. Montel Williams is pretty strong on beneficial treatment, and a lot of people with cancer find it to help with nausea. And I, for one, think that we should expand our horizons and all opportunities we can to people who have cancer and other life-threatening diseases to ease their pain and their anguish, to alleviate their hunger desires for which they may have been limited and other because of the illness, and to give them some type of ability to smile. That would be a nice thing to do. Mr. Fleming talks a lot about medical marijuana, but doesn't bring up anything about the effects of arrests. Dr. Hart talks about that a lot. You have to balance everything in society and how it affects people. And, yeah, maybe 9%, I don't know what the figures that Dr. Volkow mentioned or Dr. Throckmorton, I think Dr. Volkow, is that 9% may become addicted at some point, et cetera. Well, a great number more than that get arrested and get a scarlet M fastened to their chest for life, which means they don't get a job maybe or a college scholarship or opportunity to live in public housing and other things. And you have to way, no question there's some bad effects, marijuana, but there are some even more harmful effects in taking people's liberty. And you take judgment, informed judgment, and you take depriving people of their liberty and putting them in jail. And there are people in jail for possession. There are lots of people in jail for possession. Even if for a short time it's not good, but some of them for a short time, some of them longer because they don't have money to get bailed out, and they don't have access to attorneys that can get them out. So that's just not accurate. We talk about 40 years of this policy. Yeah, Nixon started the war on drugs, and we know that Nixon did it for politics, and that Ehrlichman talked to him about it, or Haldeman. I get the two of them confused, the twin devils of that administration. No, they're not the twin devils. There were lots of devils in that administration, but they were the two poster children for harmful conduct and dirty tricks that were illegal, brought down a president. But they admitted that what scheduling at Schedule I was for the purpose of politics, and it was a great thing, and it had to do with race. And it really goes back to the 30s, and while President Roosevelt probably wasn't too aware of it, Harry Anslinger came around, and it was the Hispanics. And Mr. Fleming talked about these myths that get out there, and all of a sudden these myths are out there about medical benefits, and then they become kind of like Goebbels, I can't say that, excuse me, pardon me, kind of like repeating lies over and over again, and they become accepted. You know, that's what reefer madness was, and those lies got perpetrated. So bottom line is what Mr. Blumenauer talked about is so true. We need research. We need study. We need study for the states. We need studies for the children. And there's no question children shouldn't be smoking marijuana, and that's not what this should be about. They shouldn't be doing alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, having sex, none of that. True, some of that happens, but it shouldn't happen, and nobody's suggesting it. But for adults in a society that prides itself on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you know, if you make it illegal, that's liberty, and some people think it's the pursuit of happiness. Whether that's true happiness or not, whether you find it in a bottle of Jack Daniels or whether you find it in a nice Pinot Noir or Budweiser or whatever, that's each person's choice in a free society. So I think the study is so important. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you, and I hope when you're shaving next, you'll hear about the 24th state.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for joining us again. And I think there are no other opening statements. So what we'll do now is turn to our three witnesses. Again, welcome them. Before I do that, let me say that members may have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. And without objection, we'll include that. Let me again welcome our three witnesses. And I don't think you all have testified before our panel before. Our method of operation, so to speak, is allow you about 5 minutes. We only have three witnesses in one panel, so we'll be a little bit generous there. But we ask you if you have additional lengthy information or data you'd like to be made part of the record, just a request through the Chair, and we'd accommodate you. Let me introduce our witnesses, and then I'll swear you in. We have first Dr. Nora Volkov, and the doctor is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Dr. Doug Throckmorton, and he is the deputy director for regulatory programs for the Food and Drug Administration. And then we have Dr. Carl Hart. He's an associate professor of psychology at Columbia University. So those are our three witnesses in this panel. This is an investigation and oversight subcommittee of Congress. So just stand, please, and I'll swear you in. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? And all of the witnesses, the record will reflect. answered in the affirmative, and I welcome each of you, and now we'll recognize you for your testimony. First, we'll have our Director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Dr. Volkow. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Good morning. I welcome, I very much appreciate the opportunity to come to speak with you, and I also very much appreciate your comments addressing and clearly identifying a subject that is complex and that has evidently polarized very much our perspectives. I like the concept of saying where the facts is, and I'm going to try to actually identify where things are, the information is factual and where the information is currently not fully available or unclear. The marijuana is used because it activates the endogenous cannabinoid signaling systems in reward areas, and the endogenous cannabinoid system actually is not just in reward areas, but it is involved in multiple functions of the brain and multiple functions of our body. And that's why there has been so much interest in terms of the potential of manipulating the endogenous cannabinoid system for a variety of medical conditions. And that's, I think, at the essence of the debate. The issue with taking marijuana, which activates the system, is that it inhibits the individual's endogenous cannabinoid system. So as a result of that, the person may be actually in a state of deprivation when the drug is no longer available. And that is an issue that needs to be addressed as one considers the effects of repeated administration of marijuana. Marijuana is the most common used illicit drug in our country, and its use is particularly high among adolescents. And this has been increasing over the past years. More high school seniors now smoke marijuana than smoke cigarettes, and we have one of the highest rates of regular use of marijuana that we've had since we've been actually evaluating it. 6.5% of 12th graders report regular use of marijuana. So that's almost daily use, which is the one that's most likely to be associated with adverse effects. This increased use of marijuana, we know, reflects a decreased perception that marijuana is risky, which then increases the prevalence of its use, certainly among teenagers. But this belief is really not backed up by evidence that has evolved over the past 10, 15 years, when these changes in perception, actually over the past 10 years, have dramatically shifted. In fact, there is significant evidence that the marijuana can have deleterious effects. Now, not everybody will get the deleterious effects. It's like not everybody that smokes cigarettes will get cancer, and yet we don't question it. But we do use that logic in order to actually address the so-called safety of marijuana. So what is it, how harmful it is, and where is the harmfulness coming from? Well, in addressing marijuana, we have to differentiate between acute and chronic effects, repeated effects. Acute effects relate to intoxication. And where is the facts? We know that marijuana impairs motor coordination, perception of time, and we do know that marijuana contributes significantly to car accidents, including fatal ones. And that is not that is basically no question. I mean, the facts are there. There is also evidence that the marijuana from studies, if you are intoxicated with marijuana, the risk of being in a car accident is basically double. And if you combine it with alcohol, the risk increases over dose of each drug alone. Now, acute intoxication of marijuana is also associated with psychotic episodes, overall most of them short-lasting. And we're starting to see reports in the medical literature of medical complications we did not know about, like cerebrovascular and cardiovascular pathology, evidently associated with a higher content THC. So what about the long-term effects of marijuana? Factual. Marijuana produces addiction, and as it mentions before, not everybody becomes addicted. 9% will become addicted of those that get exposed, 16% if they started when they were teenagers, and 50% if they use it regularly. The discussion of is marijuana gateway drug, very well placed. Marijuana usually precedes the use of other drugs, but this does not negate that the other drugs can actually also act as gateway drugs. Preclinical studies in animals indicates that exposure early on actually changes the sensitivity of the reward centers of the brain. Also, animal studies show that the exposure to marijuana early on impairs with the connections among neurons, the connections that form in order for neurons to communicate with each other are disturbed by the use of marijuana very early on, cannabinoids. In human subjects, there is evidence that those that were exposed very early on to marijuana have disrupted connectivity in areas of the brain involved with memory and interoceptive awareness. There's also evidence from many studies independent that individuals that smoke marijuana regularly during adolescence actually are much more likely to drop out of school and have much lower educational achievement. The mechanisms underlying these associations, however, are not completely understood and could be multifactorial. Now, because of all of this, and even though there are many studies that have emerged, many of them have been criticized for one of the factors. They may have not had sufficient sample sizes. They were not controlling for premorbid performance prior to use of marijuana. They actually did not follow individuals long enough, or they did not have the sensitivity. So it is clear in my brain right now, as we look forward, that we need to actually, as an organization that develops evidence, we need to conduct a properly evaluated study to assess the consequences of marijuana exposure in teenagers. Because regardless of what happens with regulations, they are the ones that are more likely to be vulnerable to the adverse effects. I want to conclude by the fact that as we look at discussions of where we are or where we are not, the greatest number of cases associated with mortality, morbidity, and economic cost to our society from drugs, by far, are the legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco, much more than the other drugs even multiply. And it's not because alcohol and tobacco, nicotine are more dangerous. They are certainly, no one will question methamphetamine or cocaine. It is because their legal status makes them more available, and actually perception of risk is much lower. And I think that we have to keep this in mind as we go into these discussions. And whatever the solutions come around, we have to look towards what we have seen in the past of consequences of some of these policies to try to minimize the risk of policies that we all want to do the right thing. And how we look at the data is slightly different. And I think that that's the value of getting together, and also, very importantly, the partnerships among the different agencies. Thanks very much for having me here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, and we'll hold them until we've heard from the other witnesses. I'll recognize next the Deputy Director for Regulatory Programs of Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Doug Throckmorton.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the role that the FDA plays in regulating marijuana in the United States. In addition to important work overseeing the approval of prescription drugs and use of drugs derived from marijuana and its constituents, FDA understands the importance of supporting efficient and scientific assessment of marijuana in connection with drug development. Marijuana contains compounds with potential to provide important new treatments for important diseases, and rigorous studies are needed to assess their potential and, where appropriate, deliver new drugs for use by Americans. FDA continues to believe that the drug approval process established by Congress represents the best way to ensure that safe and effective new medicines from marijuana are available as soon as possible for the largest numbers of patients. First, FDA is the agency that is responsible for the assessment and regulation of new drugs in the United States. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act requires that drugs be shown to be safe and effective for their intended uses before being marketed. In addition, drugs must be shown to be manufactured consistently, lot to lot, with high quality. Because many factors influence the makeup of plant materials, such as temperature, time of year, and location, this essential part of drug development presents special challenges when the drug is derived from a botanical source, such as marijuana. As a part of our work to regulate prescription drugs, FDA also provides scientific recommendations to the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, on drugs and other products that have the potential to be abused, so-called controlled substances, including marijuana. While DEA is the lead Federal agency responsible for regulating controlled substances and enforcing the Controlled Substances Act, FDA, working with NIDA, provides scientific recommendations about the appropriate controls for those substances. To make these recommendations, FDA is responsible for preparing what's called an 8-factor analysis, which is a document that is used to assess how likely a drug is to be abused. At the request of DEA, in 2001 and again in 2006, FDA conducted a review of the available data for marijuana and recommended that marijuana remain in Schedule I, the most restrictive schedule, both because of its high potential for abuse and because there was not sufficient evidence that marijuana had an accepted medical use in treatment in the United States. Next, let me turn to the FDA work to support the efficient development of drugs from marijuana. As a part of our mission to promote availability of safe and effective medical products for all Americans in all therapeutic areas, FDA is actively streamlining regulatory processes at various steps along the path, from drug discovery to delivery to a patient. We understand that this is an important part of our mission. We have developed and successfully used a number of flexible and innovative approaches intended to expedite drug development. These approaches are being applied to developing drugs derived from marijuana. For example, FDA granted fast-track designation to Sativex, composed primarily of 2 cannabinoids, being studied for the treatment of pain in patients with advanced cancer. More recently, in June of this year, FDA granted fast-track designation to the investigational cannabidiol product Epidiolex, being developed for the treatment of childhood epilepsy. As a part of this work to encourage efficient drug development, FDA recognizes that many patients are urgently waiting for new, potentially beneficial drugs, and we are committed to supporting timely patient access to them. FDA's expanded access mechanisms are designed to facilitate the availability of investigational drug products to patients while those drugs are being studied for approval. These mechanisms are also being used in the area of marijuana drug development. For example, GW Pharmaceuticals has announced that they have established 21 expanded access INDs for Epidiolex to treat patients with epilepsy syndromes, and to date, over 300 patients have received Epidiolex through those programs. In support of scientific research into marijuana and its constituents, FDA also works with researchers who are developing new drugs from marijuana. Recently, several states have announced their intentions to study it for therapeutic purposes, and FDA is providing ongoing assistance to support their efforts. I've had the opportunity to speak with many of those researchers from those states myself. For example, Georgia and New York have recently announced their intention to develop clinical trials using Epidiolex to help treat patients diagnosed with epilepsy. Finally, the FDA is working with other federal agencies on marijuana. In addition to the work I mentioned earlier on drug scheduling with NIDA and DEA, our scientific staffs work closely together to understand the effects of marijuana. FDA also participates in regular meetings with the Office of the National Drug Control Policy and other federal agencies discussing marijuana. To close my remarks then, there is considerable public interest in developing new therapies from marijuana. FDA understands this and will support the continuing development of specific new drugs that are safe, effective, and manufactured to a high quality. Drug development grounded in rigorous scientific research is essential to determining the appropriate uses of marijuana and its constituents in the treatment of human disease. We are committed to making this process as efficient as possible and looking for ways to speed the availability of new drugs from marijuana for the American public. Thank you for your interest in this important topic. I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you, and we'll get back to you with questions. I want to now recognize the Associate Professor of Psychology at Columbia University, Dr. Carl Hart. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Chairman Mica, Ranking Member Connolly, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is a privilege and honor to offer my expertise in your quest to more comprehensively understand the impact of marijuana on the individual as well as our society. As you all pointed out, I'm a tenured professor at Columbia University in the departments of psychology and psychiatry. I also serve as a research scientist in the division on substance abuse at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. I am also a member of the National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse, and I'm on the board of directors for the College of Problems of Drug Dependence and also for Drug Policy Alliance. As you all may know, I am a trained neuropsychopharmacologist who has spent the past 16 years studying the neurophysiological, psychological, and behavioral effects of marijuana. As part of my research, I have given thousands of doses of marijuana to people, and I have carefully studied the immediate and delayed effects of the drug on them. My findings are published in some of the most prestigious scientific journals. I have co-authored a popular college-level textbook that focuses on drugs and society. My most recent book, High Price, is aimed at educating the general public about drugs and preventing drug-related tragedies. But I want to be clear here today that my remarks will focus primarily on the effects of marijuana on adults, since we all agree that recreational use of marijuana as well as other drugs by children should be discouraged. So to be clear, marijuana is a psychoactive drug. That means that it alters the functioning of brain cells and influences our thinking, mood, and behavior. It can have both positive as well as negative effects. This is true of all psychoactive drugs, including alcohol and tobacco. A major potential negative consequence of marijuana use is addiction. As has been pointed out correctly, marijuana, about 9% of the people who use marijuana will become addicted. By comparison, however, about 15% of the people who use alcohol will become addicted, and a third of the people who smoke tobacco will become addicted. The point is, yes, marijuana is addictive. However, when you compare it to our illegally available drugs, its addictive potential is lower. Another concern related to marijuana is disruption of cognitive functioning. As is the case with alcohol, during marijuana intoxication, some cognitive operations, such as response time, may be temporarily slowed, but the intoxicated individual is able to respond to environmental stimuli in appropriate manners. Marijuana intoxication typically lasts no more than 2 to 4 hours, depending upon the individual's level of experience with the drug. It is important to understand that even during periods of intoxication, the user is able to carry out his or her usual behavioral repertoire. That means engaging in appropriate social behaviors, including responding to emergencies. After the intoxicating effects of marijuana have dissipated, there are no detectable physiological or behavioral effects of the drug in recreational and casual users. This is similar to what is observed following alcohol intoxication. In fact, many of the people who I have studied, who participate in our research studies where we actually give the drug, they are responsible members of their community. They are graduate students, they are actors, they are school teachers, they are waitresses, waiters, professors, lawyers, and among other professions. One of the least discussed effects of our current approach to marijuana deals with arrest rates. It was briefly mentioned here today. Each year, there are more than 700,000 marijuana arrests, which accounts for half of all the drug arrests in the country. By the way, the overwhelming majority of the people who are arrested for marijuana, 80% or so, are arrested for simple drug possession. But what's worse is that at the state level, black people are 2 to 7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than their white counterparts. And at the federal level, Hispanics represent 2/3 of all the people arrested for marijuana violation, despite the fact that blacks, Hispanics, and whites use the drug at similar rates. The scientific community has virtually ignored this shameful marijuana-related effect. The National Institute on Drug Abuse could help remedy this situation by requesting research applications that explicitly focuses on race. For example, trying to understand the long-term consequences of marijuana arrests on black and Hispanic people, especially as they relate to disrupting one's life trajectory. So, as we move forward here to develop a more rational approach to marijuana in our society, it is my most sincere hope that we not only focus on the potential negative effects of the drug, but we also include some of the beneficial effects of the drug and, most importantly, the consequences of our current policies on certain community of colors. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And I thank all 3 of our witnesses for their testimony, and we'll start with some questions. First of all, I'll start with our Director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse and ask the question, President Obama had said that smoking marijuana is not very different from smoking cigarettes, and he also said that marijuana is less dangerous than alcohol or intimated that. I think we had up on the screen his exact comments. How would you respond, Doctor?
Well, what happens is people...
You'll have to pull that up for some reason.
We all use our own experience to actually get conclusions. And as I mentioned, for cigarette smoking, not everybody that smokes cigarettes is going to get lung cancer. And so in their experience, this is not a harmful drug. And there are very significant differences. We know variability probably determined by genetic factors that make some people more vulnerable and others more resilient. To the comment of whether marijuana is more or less harmful than alcohol and tobacco, and again, I do agree with my colleague, Dr. Hart, there is always positive and negatives. I think one of the issues in those comparisons, which I don't like to start with, is that you are comparing the percentage of people that become addicted to marijuana when they get exposed to it, which is 9%, versus, say, 15% for alcohol, which is much higher. But alcohol is legal, and marijuana is illegal. And the legal status affects the norms and the willingness of people to get exposed to it. So in order to really compare the relative potency of one drug versus the other, vis-a-vis how humans end up consuming it, you have to have similar social conditions for both of them. And so in animal models, nicotine is not very addictive. It's very hard to make animals addicted to nicotine, but it's a very widely available drug. It is dispersed to a route of administration that leads to very high concentration, which is smoking, just like marijuana. And also, finally, the other aspect that we need to consider, which was brought by Dr. Fleming, is that the marijuana that he may have smoked is likely to have had, we know, probably very low content of 9-THC, opposed to the marijuana that we currently have now. And we do know that the higher the content of 9-THC, the higher the likelihood that you will develop adverse effects and much more likely to become addicted to it. So I think that all of these factors...
You also testified that marijuana becomes is responsible for being a gateway drug.
Well, epidemiological data has shown that most individuals that smoke cocaine or take heroin started with marijuana, but they also show that they started with alcohol and nicotine. So this could be just a social phenomena of which is the drug that's most readily available, or a pharmacological effect of the drug, that when you take it when you are an adolescent brain, when your brain is developing very rapidly, influences, primes your brain in such a way that then you become more vulnerable to other drugs, which would then explain why, for example, individuals that get exposed to marijuana before age 17 are not only at greater risk of becoming addicted to marijuana, but they are also at greater risk of becoming addicted to other drugs of abuse, even when you control for genetic backgrounds and environmental backgrounds. So there is evidence to suggest that there may be a priming effect that could account for this concept of a gateway drug.
I'm not a scientist, but we've had testimony now, and I guess some of these reviews also indicate that there's, particularly when used by adolescents, that there's a diminution in the level of intelligence. Is there evidence to that?
This study was actually the one that you're referring to, was a study done on New Zealand in 1,050 individuals that were monitored periodically from age 13 until age 32. So they were evaluating their cognitive performance actually before they took marijuana. And what they found that those that consistently took marijuana during adolescence have overall lower, 8 points lower IQ when they were consistently taking it.
Okay.
That is a strong study, but like anything else in science, you need to replicate. But its evidence we cannot ignore, because it actually does address many of the criticisms that have been done by prior studies.
Okay. Now, Dr. Throckmorton, you don't set marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic, but you do participate in the process which you described, and I guess you recommend to DEA and DOJ, and you were not prepared to make any other recommendation but to keep it in Schedule I?
So in 2001 and again in 2006.
Right, 2001, 2006, you did the last studies. But right now, the question around the country is, this is classified as a Schedule I drug. We had DEA in. We didn't have a DOJ. We had a U.S. attorney. But the DEA was adamantly opposed to taking it, I think, out of a Schedule I classification. What's your position? Has it changed from the 2000? And you said 2001 they studied it, 2006 they studied it, and where are we now?
So if I could say, there are two reasons why the FDA conducts an 8-factor analysis, why we look at the scheduling of a product. And I think it might be worthwhile just making sure that we understand both of those, because they both relate to potentially to marijuana. The first is if we have a drug submitted to us for approval. So a new drug for an indication comes to us, including a drug that comes from marijuana, we would be required to conduct an analysis.
And you also testified that you're looking at several of, I don't know if I'm not a scientist, of derivatives, or one was Epidiolex?
Epidiolex, yes.
Epidiolex, that you're looking at that. And again, several others I think you indicated. And it's the first time I've heard testimony about, again, the direction you're taking on medical marijuana. But again, and that's part of your responsibility. I mean, I don't know how soon it's going to be before we see FDA-approved stamp on that stuff. Well, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah.
But the process, too, of the Schedule I is part of what has been at issue here. We have DEA, we have the Department of Justice. We have, just in the District of Columbia, we have 26 Federal law enforcement agencies enforcing Federal law, and it is still an illegal narcotic in the highest classification. Are you about to change that?
I wouldn't be able to comment about potential changing of our recommendation. First, my recommendation would go through layers above me.
How could we get? Can we get the?
Well, that was what I wanted to. That was why I wanted to talk a little about the two pathways. So,
well, one is I mean, you do have some studies that you're conducting about the medical benefits of some derivatives, and you are on the path of. But again, the major question is the Schedule I classification, and you're not prepared to say there's going to be any change.
What I'm prepared to say is that under two possible scenarios, we would have to conduct another 8-factor analysis on marijuana or its constituents. And either of those scenarios—
Do you plan to do an A-factor analysis? The last one was done in 2006, right?
The last one requested for us by the DEA. So there are the two ways are: one, a drug company submits a drug for application to us, and we conduct an 8-factor.
That's not what we're talking about.
And the second one, and I understand that's the center of your interest, is the one where the DEA requests that we conduct an additional 8-factor analysis. They've done 2001, 2006 did those at those point, recommended that it remain in Schedule I. It's public knowledge that the DEA has received additional citizens petitions asking them to look again at the medical evidence surrounding the safety and effectiveness.
But that would bounce back to you.
And that has been sent to us, and we are in the process of conducting that 8-factor analysis. We've not yet come to a conclusion.
So you are conducting an A-factor analysis and update?
Yes.
Okay. When do you expect that would be done?
I wouldn't be able to comment, partly because it's a recommendation first. So we make a recommendation to Health and Human Services after we consult with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and then that recommendation goes to the DEA.
And are you prepared to tell us, Dr. Valca, your recommendation at this point?
Well, I have to.
On moving forward.
I have to see exactly what the data is, and then definitively we'll act swiftly with the information.
So you're going to rely on the first data that's produced by the A-factor analysis, and then you would respond to that. That's the order? Okay. Dr. Hart, did you want to respond to anything?
Yeah, it seems to me that we need to clarify some of there's been some misinformation stated. There was a comment made about the average age of people who smoke marijuana now, begin smoking marijuana is like 10. That's just not true. It's about 17 or 18. And also, as we move forward and think about the increasing amount of marijuana potency, it certainly has increased. But the question becomes, what does that mean? When you think about potency and you think about people smoking marijuana, one of the advantages of smoking a drug compared to some other route of administration is that when you smoke a drug, you can quickly detect the potency or the strength of the psychoactive effects. So that means you will decrease the amount you intake. It's like drinking a stiff drink versus drinking a beer. You don't drink the two the same way. So this issue of potency has been overstated. Second point, when we think about gateway drug, as was been talked about here, it is true that the majority of the people who go on to use heroin and cocaine may have used marijuana first. That's true. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that the majority of the people who smoke marijuana don't go on to cocaine or heroin. If we're calling marijuana a gateway drug, we have to think about this fact. The last 3 occupants of the White House all smoked marijuana. If we use this logic about gateway, we could very well say that marijuana is a gateway drug to the White House. It just doesn't make sense. Finally, when we think about IQ, the study that has shown the decrease in IQ points, it's important to note the group that has shown the decrease in IQ points, there were 20 people in that group. And when you look at the IQ range that they have decreased to, they remain within the normal range. They are normal. And so it's important for people to understand what the science actually says.
Thank you. And we'll yield now to Mr. Conley.
Thank you. And I do want to remind Dr. Hart that one of those 3 presidents never inhaled.
That's what he said.
Dr. Throckmorton, I think the Chairman and I were both struck by your testimony because if we understood your testimony, you were acknowledging that, in fact, there were positive medicinal benefits in terms of medicinal treatment with a derivative of marijuana for epileptic seizures. Was that correct?
No. What I was saying was that there are people who are very enthusiastic about the potential for cannabidiol and THC and some of its derivatives to treat a number of important medical conditions. My job, given that potential, is to make sure that that development happens as quickly as possible.
Okay. But your testimony does not dismiss that possibility.
Absolutely not. I look forward to seeing the full data.
Okay. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but because both the Chairman and I thought we heard you acknowledge that at least there's some preliminary data beyond the placebo effect with respect to the treatment for epileptic seizures.
Yeah, I really wouldn't be able to comment on that.
Okay. You think the science is too early?
It's important science to get right.
But conversely, neither are you testifying that it is in fact only a placebo effect.
We have approved drugs from plants, and this plant has several compounds in it that people have identified as very promising. Our job is to get those developed.
I think that's really important because my colleague, Dr. Fleming, seemed to suggest it could only have a placebo effect, and in fact the science doesn't tell us that necessarily. The science may very well lead us to the fact that there is an empirical, efficacious medical effect that can benefit people like my constituent, Jennifer Collins, who suffers 300 seizures a day. It would come as news to her family that the effect is only a placebo effect. And let me just say, that family had to move their daughter to another state. She's separated from her friends at school. She's separated from her family for medical reasons, not to get a high, not for recreational use, but because her body is tormented 300 times a day with epileptic seizures. And we owe it to her and the other families in this country that may suffer from similar medical conditions to put aside the politics, put aside the bias scientifically that has prevented us from genuinely researching this topic to see whether, in fact, there can be an efficacious
Would the gentleman
effect.
yield?
I would briefly yield to my colleague.
Yeah, I never suggested that there was a placebo effect at all. All I said was that we have no proven benefit to seizures or otherwise, and that to simply go out and mass produce this, allow the population as a whole to use it, when in fact it is in research and we are trying to find answers on this, makes no sense at all.
Reclaiming my time, and I thank my colleague. And by the way, I'd be delighted to have my colleague meet my constituents so that he could hear their story directly.
I would be happy to as well, but it's
okay.
still an anecdotal.
But I would also just point out my friend has just created a straw man. No one's talking about mass production and letting everyone use it any way they want. That's not the topic of this hearing.
That's medicinal marijuana, sir.
Well, actually, talk to the 22 states.
There are more marijuana.
I have, excuse me, this is my time. But I would just suggest to my colleague, you can talk to the 22 states who have decided otherwise. And if Louisiana doesn't want to do it, that's its choice. But there are 22 states and the District of Columbia that have decided otherwise because they feel they've been held back at the Federal level. Now, Dr. Volkow, your testimony seems to completely disregard lots of other data. You referred to marijuana, as Dr. Hart said, as a gateway drug. Is there any evidence that marijuana is uniquely so, any more or less than other controlled substances?
I think that in my testimony, I explicitly stated that we have no evidence that marijuana as a gateway drug is different from alcohol and tobacco, and that tobacco, in fact, primes.
But isn't it even misleading to call it a gateway drug? I mean, if you've got an addictive personality, you started with something. It might be prescription drugs, it might be alcohol, it might be tobacco. I mean, there's no evidence that marijuana stands out among those other substances if you've got an addictive personality and you're going to go on to an addiction, is there?
No, absolutely. And if you have an addictive personality, it may just be what's more available as a young person that will just start to take first.
I guess I'm suggesting to you, however, given the data, for example, you only cited the addiction rate for marijuana. You didn't mention, in contrast to what? So 9% of the people who start out with marijuana become addicted. But you didn't mention that 33% of people who start out with tobacco become addicted. And as Dr. Hart pointed out, 15% with alcohol. What is it if you started out with cocaine? What's the addiction rate of that?
Cocaine is probably like 20, 25%.
Okay. So in all of these cases so far, they're much higher than marijuana.
Cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin are much higher than marijuana, but you need to, when you're making these comparisons, you have to compare within illegal and legal because the social changes make the perception different and make it much more available.
I understand. But for you to only cite the addiction rate with marijuana seems to me to be cherry-picking statistics for a purpose.
I only had 5 minutes, and I apologize for not saying it because I always present all of the data, but I had 5 minutes.
All right. Dr. Hart had the same 5 minutes and managed to somehow put it in context. Let me ask you about NIDA. Right now, NIDA has a monopoly on the production of marijuana to be used for FDA-approved research and medical purposes, and that's been the case since 1974. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
That's your understanding?
Yes.
Your title is Director.
Yes, that's my understanding. It's a use of words.
All right. Is there any other Schedule I drug used for research purposes that's available only from one government source like yours?
You were correct, and I don't think there is.
All right. So again, unique to marijuana, you have exclusive control for research purposes, unlike any other substance.
Correct, in the United States. Yes.
What's the rationale for that? Is there any rationale for that?
I guess that one of the rationales, that the reasons why this is described to be the case is that you want to be able to have control over the material that you are providing for research.
Why wouldn't that be true about cocaine?
Cocaine has different mechanisms for, I mean, it is a drug that is regulated differently vis-a-vis where we get it for researchers. The production of marijuana is based on plants.
All right. DEA has licensed privately funded manufacturers privately funded manufacturers to produce methamphetamines, LSD, MDMA, heroin, cocaine, and a host of other controlled substances for research purposes. Is that not correct?
They are, for research purposes, yes, and most of those go to preclinical studies, laboratory animals.
Right now, HHS guidelines prohibit the use of NIDA-produced marijuana for use in research designed to develop marijuana into an FDA-approved prescription medicine. Is that correct?
Not to my understanding. To my understanding is we provide the marijuana for clinical research that has been approved by the committee of the DEA, the FDA, and by
there's no restriction that says, but you can't use it for research that's aimed at producing an FDA-approved prescription medicine. Is that correct?
Well, there the wording, I don't want to be imprecise, because when you say the FDA-approved medication, since it is a Schedule I, I don't want to say something that is incorrect. We can fund research that can provide the evidence that then can be brought into the FDA to bring up an argument about why this should be considered as a medical application. That's what we do. And there's no, and we will—
Dr. Throckmorton, I'm sorry, but I have limited time. I appreciate your answer. Dr. Throckmorton, is that correct?
Could you say, just ask briefly again?
Yes.
Sorry.
The HHS guidelines prohibit the use of NIDA-produced marijuana, and it has a monopoly on it, for use in research that could be designed or is designed to develop marijuana into an FDA-approved prescription medicine.
No, I don't believe that's true. I believe, in fact, we do see applications that make use of the NIDA marijuana.
I would ask you both to get back to the committee for the record.
Absolutely.
Because that would be at variance with our understanding, but that's good to know. Human studies in Schedule I drugs have to be approved by the FDA. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
But studies involving marijuana, additional approval also has to be sought from NIDA and HHS. Is that not correct?
Scientifically, they have to be approved by a committee on NIDA.
Is that true about heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines? Do they have to go through that triple-tier approval process for research as well?
No,
on human studies?
The approval for those human studies, most of it comes from review committees at the NIH, and if the DEA approves of giving them the drug, then it's a different procedure.
But don't we? Yeah, it's a different process, and it's less cumbersome. What is it about marijuana? You know, I asked the deputy director of the DEA at one of our previous hearings, name a single death in America due to an overdose from marijuana. He couldn't do it. Prescription drugs, legal, every 19 minutes. We could cite other substances as well. Now, that's not to say, therefore, we should be concerned about marijuana. But it does raise the question of whether our behavior has been appropriate with respect to marijuana. The restrictions in research, the extraordinary incarceration, prosecution, and incarceration rates. Look at what we've unleashed. We've created a subclass of criminal behavior in America that seems out of proportion to the fact that, as Dr. Hart said, 80% are for small, possession. Now, ideally, they wouldn't have it at all. But we have really skewed the system. And we've created all kinds of special barriers with respect to marijuana as if it were the uber alles of all drug abuse, when in fact it is not. And we've impeded the ability to have legitimate research that could benefit human health. And it just doesn't, it's very hard for me to frankly understand why we continue to insist it's a Class I substance. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Mr. Turner, gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the passion that Mr. Connolly has, but I'm going to return the hearing back to members asking questions and the panel testifying. Thank you for having this hearing
I hope
today.
that's our hearings here in this committee.
It should be our goal. So public health encompasses a wide range of considerations, and I'm certainly pleased that we have National Institute on Drug Abuse and the Food and Drug Administration representatives today. As it stands, what role does the FDA play in providing consumer protections for individuals who use recreational drugs in the United States? Dr. Throckmorton, for example, does the FDA mandate that the products sold in Colorado or Washington State bear warning labels? What about statements as to the potency or strength of the product? Is there information provided to the user at all? What information does the FDA currently have relating to the strength of various marijuana strains, and how is that information provided to consumers, and should State governments have it, and how does the FDA work with States to make certain that they have that information? Dr. Throckmorton?
I hope I got all 4 of those down. I'll try to respond to them, and if I miss
It's very simple. What do you know, and how does it get to a user?
So as far as our role in terms of the State's activities going on in Colorado, they're very limited. We do communicate with the Public Health Department there because they're doing important work to understand the impact of marijuana, the impact of the State laws there and things, and the access to marijuana in Colorado. With regards to labeling, we have no role in terms of the labeling of the products that are approved under State law in Colorado, including things like strength, purity, any assurances like that. I think that's an important feature of approved drug development that differs from some of the things that are going on in Colorado. And then finally, you asked about our interactions with Colorado. As I said, we work with the Public Health Department there because it's important for us to understand where marijuana is going, the kinds of experiences they're having.
Dr. Throckmorton, I just want to go back to that. You just said that nothing to do with labeling. Well, and interestingly enough, food can be harmless or not harmless, and you're very active in its labeling, but here this clearly is a drug and you're not active at all in any of the information sharing or with respect to the issues of labeling.
No, to be clear, the products in Colorado are not approved drugs. They've not come before the agency. We haven't reviewed them for safety, effectiveness,
and so there's a process that's been skipped so that there's no interaction.
Those are the things that my agency oversees. Those are the things we're trying to encourage to the fullest extent possible.
But if I went to go buy a bottle of ketchup, I mean, that labeling is an issue that's been under the FDA, but yet we have this as a product and it has not. And Dr. Volkow, in the absence of warning labels or a statement of some kind as to the potency or strength of the marijuana an individual is using, it seems that some very basic consumer protections are absent here. For example, marijuana can be directly linked to impaired driving. Even Dr. Hart would indicate from his own research that it would have that. But again, back to no labeling, no warning. With regard to this serious safety concern, are you aware of any existing methodology that might enable a law enforcement officer with probable cause to assess whether a driver is operating a vehicle under the influence of marijuana? How do they determine that? I need you to turn your microphone on, ma'am.
With marijuana, it's particularly difficult because you actually have marijuana and its constituents can be in your body for a long period of time, up to 1 week or sometimes even 2 weeks. But that does not mean that you are impaired. So whereas with alcohol, you can measure a certain level, and you know that that is associated with impaired functioning, with marijuana it's much more complex. So there's research going on to try to get biomarkers that will allow us to see not that someone has smoked marijuana, but that someone is within the range that is dangerous.
Right. And see, obviously with alcohol use, as we understand, it would be the breathalyzer that can be applied, but law enforcement in this area is left without any real specific tools that make it very difficult to apply what is the law and what clearly, even in Dr. Hart's research, shows an effect on the impairment of driving and operating a vehicle. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen, would you yield?
Yes.
Just want to observe that last comment sounded like a comment, not a question to the panel. Thank you.
Mr. Turner, as a denizen of 400 Mass, would you like to respond? We share the same condo unit. Thank you. Dr. Volkow, one thing I can't grasp real well is when Dr. Hart pointed out that the studies say 9% of people who smoke marijuana get addicted, 15% of people who do alcohol get addicted. You talked about legal and illegal, as if marijuana was legal, more people would smoke, which is true. how does that affect a ratio of 9% when it's not about the people, it's about the drug and its interaction with people? Is there not a large enough class of people that made up the 9% to be an accurate gauge of those that would become addicted? Are you suggesting that those that have not smoked because it's illegal are more likely to get addicted and will run the level from 9% up to 15%?
Many people don't smoke because it is illegal. So the moment that it's legalized, they do adapt to social norms, and that modulates their behavior. But more importantly, I think that what determines the extent to which a person gets exposed to a drug and becomes addicted is not that you get exposed once, but the likelihood that you will be exposed repeatedly. So by having a drug that is legal, particularly in adolescents, they are actually much more likely to get exposed to it repeatedly than if the drug is illicit. So the more you get exposed to it, the greater the likelihood that you could become addicted. And that's why I say, if you are going to compare it, you have to compare it in the similar size.
I understand what you're saying. I just simply, I don't agree. And I think Dr. Hart, how would you respond to that?
I don't know how to respond. I agree with your point in terms of as has been pointed out accurately, marijuana is the most frequently smoked illicit drug. We have about 18 million current users in the country. I think those numbers are sufficient to determine what the addictive potential will be. But, you know, it's an empirical question, but I think that there's sufficient.
Thank you, Doctor. You talked to Dr. Volkow about, you said, and I guess there are car accidents involving marijuana, but you said marijuana and car accidents are particularly fatal accidents, and that those are facts. What are the facts? What are the facts you're relying upon?
Data from the Department of Transportation, and in fact...
And what are those? What's that data say?
The data says that unequivocally the use of marijuana is associated with doubling your risk for getting into a car accident, and there's data specific. Doubling
your risk of getting in a car accident is distinguished from not smoking marijuana.
From not being intoxicated when you're driving the car.
Right, but how does it relate to alcohol?
Alcohol is much greater risk.
Right, and let me submit, because these are kind of somewhat red herrings. Nobody in the world, I don't think, nobody I know in Congress or anywhere I know in the world that's dealing with this is suggesting that adolescents should be smoking marijuana, or that anybody should be driving a car while under the influence. And the whole problem may be solved by Uber cars. If you just pick up and you have more people, that may take care of the problem. But nobody's suggesting that should happen. Dr. Throckmorton, I think you said that y'all are doing some study on possibly looking at Schedule 1 in marijuana.
We've been requested to conduct another 8-factor analysis, and that requires that we look at 8 sets of data that Congress laid out. They said, look at these factors and then make a recommendation to the DEA about what the appropriate schedule is. And so we're working through those factors.
Is there no question, even without studying, to know that cocaine is a more likely addictive substance than marijuana, and that heroin is too?
Scheduling isn't just about comparative risk, though. The other aspect about scheduling, and the reason why cocaine has features that allow it to be at a different schedule, is that it has described benefits. So there are approved uses for cocaine as a topical anesthetic and things like that. With those approved uses comes accepted medical use in the United States. And that's the thing that's fundamentally missing at present from our current conclusions regarding marijuana, is that absence of accepted medical use. Typically, the best way to demonstrate accepted medical use has been through a drug approval. So with an approval comes accepted medical use. And that's why I started out saying that that's another pathway to think about as far as rescheduling of marijuana, looking at other avenues to encourage better science, fully understand its benefits and risks, and as a part of that, reconsider the scheduling.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you once again for this hearing. I think that both Dr. Volkow and Dr. Throckmorton have done a splendid job. I do think to some extent they have remained, which is understandable because of their positions in the government within the silos in which they are authorized. And so they've talked about marijuana and health and marijuana and addiction and marijuana in these areas. But Dr. Hart has taken a holistic approach. He's not siloed by his government job and his superiors, and it is a holistic approach when you've taken in this case and to judge it as against the merits of incarcerating hundreds of thousands of people and putting millions of people in a secondary class for the rest of their lives because of what might have been a adolescent or young or mature choice or mistake, however you want to look at it. Should they be punished? Is the punishment relative to the action merited? And so I thank Dr. Hart for his holistic approach, and I know y'all would probably take the same ones if you didn't have the straitjacket of government jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll turn to Dr. Fleming. Well, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hart, you're obviously a very strong advocate for the decriminalization, even legalization of marijuana. Would that be correct?
I'm an advocate for justice and science.
Well, that's, again, it's a yes or no. Are you an advocate for legalization of marijuana?
No,
yes
I'm not. No, I'm not an advocate.
Okay. Are you an advocate for decriminalization?
Wait. If you're going to ask me a question,
yes or no question, sir.
If you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it.
It's yes or no.
I am an advocate for decriminalization. Yes, I am, and
but not legalization.
No.
Okay. Now,
but I am not against legalization. I am for what makes sense for the society as a whole.
Okay, but again, along the way, we have to make a decision, yes or no. So you're saying that you are in favor of decriminalization, and you're not against the legalization. Is that a correct characterization?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, you make a strong argument, taking the data, turning it on its side, and doing a lot of things with it. But I would suggest to you a lot of it is inaccurate and out of date. For instance, you say the beginning use age of marijuana is 17. That may have been true 20 years ago when it wasn't being legalized or medicinalized. But what we're finding out today is, like alcohol and tobacco, the average starting age is in the range of 9 to 12. That is the average starting range. In places where marijuana is widely available through decriminalization and through legalization, medicinalization, we're seeing that age close in on the tobacco and alcohol. In fact, just the other day, they reported 4-year-olds ingesting marijuana through the goodies, the baked goods, and so forth, and even 4th graders dealing marijuana. So you see, what Dr. Volkow is suggesting is quite true, and that is, as the threats go away, as it becomes legalized or decriminalized, and the stigma is removed, the usage rates go up, and so do the addiction rates. So again, that explains the 9 versus 15%. If you put marijuana at the same status as alcohol and tobacco, you're going to see similar, if not greater, rates. But the thing that I think is unforgivable in your statement—
Can I respond to that?
No, sir. The thing that I find unforgivable in your statement is that you said that, let me see if I get this correct, marijuana only remains in a person's system for a few hours. Sir.
No. You misunderstood. You cannot.
No. You cannot. No, sir. I have.
That's wrong.
Yes.
I did not say that.
Okay. I
did not say that.
All right. Specifically, how long does marijuana stay in the system?
Marijuana can stay in your system for as long as 30 days, depending upon the level of the users.
That is correct. You suggested.
Of course it's correct. I do these studies.
You suggested otherwise. And we also heard from testimony yesterday in the Addiction Caucus that not only does it remain in the body, but it remains active longer than alcohol. So to suggest that marijuana is less active and for a shorter period of time than alcohol is simply incorrect. Do you concede that?
I don't know what you heard.
All right, but I'm asking you specifically, which stays in the body longer, alcohol or marijuana?
Marijuana, of course.
Okay, very good. We got that. All right, now, Dr. Volkow, You said something I thought was very interesting and something I very agree with, and it's the theme of my book in 2007. You said that marijuana and other drugs, anything addicting, has a priming effect in the brain. The human brain, particularly the immature brain, is still open to all sorts of stimuli that may occur, whether it's cannabinoid receptors, dopamine receptors, norepinephrine, whatever the receptors are. And so would you elaborate on this priming effect and the fact that the younger people are who use addicting substances, the more likely they're to have problems down the road. And again, that's in the context of decriminalization and legalization, because we all know that if it's illegal, it's less likely to be in the home available to kids through their parents. But if it's legal, it is more likely to be there. So would you please comment on that?
What we know, and this is true but certainly for alcohol, nicotine, and marijuana, is the earlier initiation, the greater the likelihood of addiction. And this is in part from the fact that these drugs stimulate endogenous signaling systems that during those developmental stages are specifically involved in creating the architecture of the brain, and it changes very dramatically in the transition from childhood into adulthood. So cannabinoids specifically, for example, will determine how a particular neuron will connect with another one. And so if you saturate and bombard with marijuana, what you're going to be doing is having a state of hyperstimulation followed by an inhibition. So that in terms disrupts this very, very perfectly orchestrated process, which is why one of the reasons why there is concern about cannabinoids. Similarly, with nicotine, you also have this role. So it's not something that's unique to marijuana, but it is clear both nicotine and marijuana can be interfering with the normal process of brain development.
So not only do we have epidemiological data that suggests that a forerunner to heroin and crack cocaine use or methamphetamine is marijuana, but also if you look at the pump priming effect of drugs, even as common as nicotine, that we see that there's really a scientific pathway, there's a brain pathway in development that certainly explains that likelihood.
And it's exactly why we are particularly focused on understanding what are the consequences of exposure to the adolescent brain of these drugs in their individual trajectories. And I completely agree. Nobody's here saying we're approving the use of these drugs in adolescents. Unfortunately, when we make decisions that are targeted to adults, we are changing also the attitudes of the adolescents, and we are influencing. So we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to actually obtain the information that can lead us to prevention efforts, whatever finally the regulations or policy are.
Right. And Dr. Throckmorton, you talk about the fact we actually are working on extracts and even fast-tracking extracts, particularly for seizure disorders, and was there other uses as well?
There's also fast-track designation that's been given to another product called Sativex being developed for cancer pain.
For cancer pain. So what we're really doing is what we typically do for other drugs, and as we find some potential benefit, we begin to try to focus and extract and purify a drug to do that. So again, that begs the question. My colleague before suggested that, well, because I said, well, look, we have the mass use now of medicinal marijuana. We have more marijuana dispensaries in California and Denver than we do Starbucks. So aren't we putting the cart before the horse? Why are we widely distributing this to millions of Americans as a treatment when we haven't done the research and extracted and purified and really gone to the very target treatment that we're really trying to achieve? What is your response to that?
As I said in my opening statement, drug development is the best way to assure safe, effective, high-quality medicines are available for the U.S. public as quickly as possible. I think that's everyone's goal in this room.
Would that be consistent with I, as a physician treating a patient with penicillin, giving them a purified product by mouth or by injection rather than giving them, say, moss or mold?
I don't think I want to comment about the other paths.
Yes.
My job at the FDA is to make sure that the drug development pathway works and is being applied efficiently.
Right. I appreciate that, and I want you to continue to do that. That's really the safe pathway to go down. Also, something we really haven't talked about, and Dr. Volkow, I'll come back to you, is recent studies are rolling out that are telling us very terrifying things about even casual use of marijuana. For instance, you alluded to structural changes of the brain. We're seeing that even in moderate users, or even casual, I think is the term they use, twice-a-day smokers, huge changes in the structure of the brain, a tremendous spike now in disease of the heart and the lungs in users. Would you elaborate on some of this data?
Well, and in the data of brain imaging studies, which actually is the one that I've personally been involved with, and I can look at it critically. I think that the studies that show evidence of harm are studies that relate to the regular use of marijuana, heavy use of marijuana. There was a recent study on adolescents that were not very frequent users, once a month or twice a month, and they reported changes. But in science, one needs to replicate. So I see it's valuable. It's the first one to document that perhaps not so frequent use could create harm, but I would be cautious until we get a replication study. With respect to the other area that has generated a lot of interest is schizophrenia, because if you give high enough doses of THC, you're going to make someone psychotic. Most of those episodes are short-lasting, but there is a group that goes into chronic psychosis that then results, is diagnosed as schizophrenia. So there's been a lot of interest to determine, can marijuana produce schizophrenia? And what the data seems to suggest is it triggers an episode, it may advance it in someone that has the vulnerability, and that is associated also with a higher content THC. So while Dr. Hart says correctly, a lot of people say you can modulate, the data actually seems to show otherwise. We're seeing higher content of plasma, content of 9-THC over all of these years.
The stronger the drug gets,
the higher the plasma content of 9-THC, the higher the consequences.
Yeah, there's no science to suggest that just because marijuana, the THC level is higher, that people are using it less to compensate. That's simply in the case. Before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say in terms of what Dr. Hart says, even if you take what Dr. Hart says at face value, which I think a lot of what he said is incorrect in the wrong direction, he still makes a very compelling case to keep this as a Schedule I drug. It is a dangerous drug, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me yield for wrap-up, Mr. Connolly.
Yes, I respect my colleague from Louisiana. I don't think he makes any such case. In fact, I think this whole hearing and the other hearings we've had, certainly for this member of Congress, who started out not wanting to touch marijuana, leave it where it is. I've been forced to study this. I've been forced to look at it. I've been forced to look at the science of it when I didn't want to, really. I had plenty of other things I was worried about. And I don't believe that the testimony we've heard today in any way reinforces how dangerous this drug is and it needs to be a Substance I drug. Quite the opposite. I think it raises profound questions about the policy of the United States of the last 30 or 40 years with respect to marijuana as a gross overreaction. The fact that cocaine is Substance II and marijuana is Substance I tells you a lot about how skewed United States policy, Federal policy is with respect to this drug. And I again suggest that's one of the reasons why 22, maybe 23 states are going in a different direction. And there's danger to that, because being out of sync with the Federal Government creates some problems. My friend is still here, and he's a doctor. And I know he has a good heart and wants to hear patient stories. And I hope he will indulge me if I just share for the record with him and with the panel the testimony of my constituent, Beth Collins, about her daughter's experience in Colorado under treatment with a derivative of marijuana, Jennifer. Jennifer's medication, administered as an oil under her tongue, is called THCA, an inactive form of THC so it has no psychoactive effect. However, it is scheduled the same as heroin, precisely because it's a Schedule I drug. Marinol, a synthetic form of THC, is Schedule III. Marinol is used to help control pain and nausea for cancer patients, but it does not help with seizures. We're currently seeing a significant decrease in Jennifer's seizures. Her neurologist here in Colorado, who's very supportive, feels that in the next few months she may be ready to start weaning from the heavy pharmaceuticals that are causing her physical, cognitive, and emotional damage. That is to say, the non-marijuana derivative pharmaceuticals. I'm witnessing a great deal of success with other epilepsy cases using various cannabis extracts here in Colorado. Of the approximately 200 pediatric patients using cannabis oil from the Realm of Caring trademark in Colorado, 78% show a reduction in seizures. 78%. Of that 78%, 25% have had a greater than 90% reduction in seizures or are seizure-free. Most of these patients have exhibited a significant increase in cognition. Now, here's where the federal regulation problem, because of substance abuse and because we so skew against marijuana in our so-called research. Rescheduling marijuana to a Schedule III drug would enable Jennifer to leave the state of Colorado for visits home to her friends and family back in Virginia. It would also allow doctors to begin studies of the efficacy of marijuana in pediatric epilepsy. While Jennifer's neurologist here is supportive, he's unable to provide us with the advice on dosing and compile his findings and observations into usable research, as this is against federal law. I and other parents are nervous about making these decisions with very little input from our children's doctors. We'd really like the guidance of our physicians, because this is a serious medical concern with serious ramifications. Current federal law prohibits us from receiving such guidance.
Would the gentleman yield for?
Of course.
Because I'd like to agree to an extent to what you say. You know, a little over a century ago, medicine moved to the direction of modern science. You know, we want to research these things. And just as Dr. Throckmorton has said, these things that hold promise should be studied. And in the case of this little girl, if we want to use rigorous scientific evaluation, enter her into a study. I have a grandson, by the way, who has cystic fibrosis, and I would love for him to get some of the experimental drugs, but he doesn't qualify at this point. So we hope that he will qualify, or a new drug will come out. But what I don't want to do is to see us throw medication at children. And so that's why I say, to me, it conflates the reality by saying that we should have medicinal pharmacies all across the nation where millions of people get a drug that is really being used for recreational use. We really need to be honest with that. To conflate that with a specific situation where a child may benefit from a non-active THC product. We all agree. I just, as a physician, ask that we go through the rigor of research.
But, you know, I very much appreciate your comment, and I agree with you. I don't have any agenda here. I'm not one who is in favor necessarily of recreational use or just legalizing it everywhere. Not at all. But I have been, as I said, because of these hearings, actually forced to reexamine what I thought I knew about marijuana. And I agree with my friend that we should have rigorous, empirical study to convince ourselves it can be used in limited circumstances or broad circumstances, whatever it may be. But I hope my colleague has heard through this hearing that marijuana, though, if we both agree that rigorous scientific research ought to occur here, it should occur in an unbiased fashion. Marijuana is not treated like any other substance. In fact, cocaine is more liberally treated for research purposes than is marijuana, and it is clear marijuana is not more dangerous.
As a point of order, I think that crack cocaine is still a Schedule I drug, correct? There's a medicinal form of cocaine that is classified differently. The same would be true of Marinol, which is a Schedule III. It's the same thing.
My point wasn't that it's not a Class 1. It is that the research allowed in cocaine has a lower standard. Marijuana is the only drug that NIDA has an exclusive research control over. In the case of cocaine, it's actually easier to do research. And if you and I both agree that we want rigorous research, I think we have to reexamine the control of NIDA.
I agree with my colleague. I think
that was the point I was
think we should allow as much research on marijuana as we would cocaine.
I thank my friend.
And if I may answer, because just to clarify, I mean, definitively, I mean, we do a lot of research as it relates to cannabinoids, and we speak about marijuana, but marijuana is a series of chemicals, many cannabinoids. So what we're interested in is extracting the active ingredients. So, for example, for the cases of these very intractable epilepsy in children, Dravat's, the compound, the cannabinoid compound that appears to be responsible is cannabidiol. Cannabidiol content of the marijuana you get out there is decreasing and decreasing, and it's not rewarding. It doesn't produce a high.
Dr. Polko, my chairman has been very generous with me on this, so I'm going to just make one point. Okay, but the mission of your agency is drug abuse. It's not medical research into the possible efficacy of derivatives from otherwise dangerous or semi-dangerous drugs. And given the fact that you have a monopoly over the control of marijuana for research purposes in the Federal family, a reasonable inference could be drawn that you are less than motivated as an agency to assist us in that rigorous medical research Dr. Fleming and I were just talking about. I'm not calling into question the legitimacy of your mission. I am saying, however, that your mission is not the same as that of those wishing to pursue medical research as to the beneficial effects. Your own testimony never even mentioned beneficial effects or even the potentiality of it.
And you're absolutely right. We're the Institute of Drug Abuse, and you're absolutely right. We have the farm that has to provide with the marijuana for research purposes, and that was something that was determined many years ago. And I think that, I mean, you're bringing it up as an issue. I think that.
Okay. I thank you. And thank my colleague, Dr. Fleming, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both. Let me just conclude with a couple of things. First of all, I take away from this, I've heard for the first time that FDA is actually going to, is in the process of conducting another A-factor analysis. Is that correct, Dr. Throt?
That's correct.
Okay. So we heard that they did it in 2001. They said no. They did it in 2006. And that is a scientific evaluation. And then you consult with NIDA, and they'll give. And we heard again the director say that they would look at your findings and make a recommendation. So as far as the Schedule 1, that analysis is underway. Correct, everyone? Okay. And you have enough funds and research capability of conducting that in a thorough manner?
Yes.
Okay. Then the second thing is, across the country, there's been the wave of votes and legislative actions to take us into using marijuana or some of its derivatives, I'm not going to be technically accurate here, for medical beneficial purposes. You don't study that, right, at NIDA?
Study it as it pertains to two conditions. Can we use some of these derivatives for the treatment of drug addiction, and can we use them for the treatment of pain?
Okay. Okay. Well, then, okay, then you do some review of its capability. We also heard, I heard for the first time, that FDA has several drugs that contain either a derivative or some form of marijuana for medical purposes, and that's under consideration for the FDA stamp of approval, for lack of a better term. Is that correct?
We talked about two drugs that are publicly launched. Yes.
Two. Okay. And you have enough funds. You have that research going on. You couldn't tell us when the A-factor analysis would be complete. If we could ask them a question, and then if you want to respond, if you have some estimate or guesstimate you could provide for the record, a timeline, and then you don't. Well, we're going to ask you the question anyway, so, and then I'll subpoena your butt back here.
Maybe you should.
No, but seriously, what we're trying to find out, because people say, well, what's going on with the Schedule I? And this has big implications. I mean, we've had the law enforcement people, we have prosecutorial folks in, we have the head of DEA, we've got ONDCP, a whole bunch of people going in different directions on this. So I just, again, we'll hear it sometime on both the rescheduling, and then we'll hear on the efficacy or the acceptance of using some of these substances that contain marijuana for medical purposes. So that's where we are in that regard. I think that's been helpful for me, and again, I've not heard some of this before. Both of you have enough resources, because then people say, well, they're not able to study, they're not able to conduct. Is there a shortage in anything you're doing, Dr.?
Both of these are important parts of our mission.
You okay, Dr. Volkow? You can always use more money. Pardon?
The amount of resources allows us to expedite the
you need more resources to tell us.
Faster. You can always do things much faster if you have more resources.
Well, I think that's something I'd ask the staff to look at, because, again, you want good review, good studies, and people have to have the adequate resources to conduct that responsibly.
I mean, Mr. Chairman, I mean, you've got a Republican chairman asking if you have enough money in your budgets. Run all the way to the bank with that question.
Well, again, I feel like a little bit like Solomon. I'm trying to get the answers. Many questions have been raised, and we have an important oversight responsibility. Societal impressions about this are changing, and attitudes are changing. Now, one of the things that, and I thought Dr. Fleming brought up something we didn't talk about, but FDA has a responsibility over consumer safety. And we now have products on the market, some are being dispensed with alleged medical benefits, not controlled by you, right?
Depending on what they're claiming, they could fall under our jurisdiction.
And I find very little today that you can eat or consume or buy off the shelf for medical remedies that has no labeling, no disclosure. So I think that we've got to look at that particular aspect too, and see where we're headed there. You do have a couple of drugs, as you said, that you're looking at specifics. But the lack of consumer information. The other thing too is going down this path of legalization. Kids are very impressionable. Everybody, Dr. Hart, Dr. Throckmorton, Dr. Volkow, all of our panelists, everyone starts out, we don't want this in the hands of adolescents. But the statistical data that we have is you're seeing more and more use of this narcotic by young people. Lack of information, but again, more promotion as far as its acceptability. And then it's hitting our most vulnerable, young people. And there are consequences. We'll get into some of them. We're going to look at differences in law and enforcement. We don't have tests that can tell us how stoned people are or how incapacitated they are that are uniform or acceptable, and then we have the residual aspect that you get, Dr. Hart, Dr. Fleming got into. The other thing, too, is now this is being touted. I talked about driving, shaving, and then watching TV today. I see the ad with a candidate in Maryland who's going to balance the budget, pay for education, just by taxing marijuana. So there are a whole host of implications of what's happening. And then if you try to get a job and you've used marijuana or you have it in your system or joined the military, there's a whole other set of sub-penalties that we currently have. So again, we raise questions, and now, Mr. Connolly, we have the return of one of our subcommittee members who's not had an opportunity to participate. He's come in, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, has asked for time, so I'll yield to him. Thought I was going to close, but that didn't work out.
I appreciate the Chair's indulgence. I appreciate the Ranking Member as well. I had to rush back, Mr. Chairman, because had things been going wrong and we dragged the FDA in here today, we'd be the first one to talk about all the delays, all the paperwork, all the folks who could have been helped if only FDA had done things differently. But I come from the great state of Georgia. And when you talk to the regulators down in Georgia, when you talk to folks trying to make a difference in people's lives in Georgia, in fact, I talked to them before this hearing, and they said, I don't know who you're going to have testify, but if you have Dr. Throckmorton testify, I want you to know he's been the most helpful Federal Government person that we have worked with in our tenure, and he is all about making a difference, wants to do it safely, wants to do it wisely, but if it's worth doing, wants to do it rapidly, and it means a lot with all the frustration and mistrust that oftentimes government rightly deserves. When we have an opportunity to brag on folks who are doing everything they can to restore that trust, everything they can to fulfill the mission of their agency, I want to be a part of saying thank you for that. Generally, when we find those folks, they get promoted out of that job on to do something where they are not nearly as effective as they used to be. So I don't wish those promotions upon you, Dr. Throckmorton. I want to tell you that candidly. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for your indulgence, and I encourage you all to watch the partnership that we have, GW Pharmaceuticals, Regents University, Georgia, New York. It's going to be something worth paying attention to.
I'm sort of in shock. I don't think we've ever had. Well, first of all, Mr. Woodall, the gentleman from Georgia, is a tiger on anyone from the Federal bureaucracy. So that holds me in awe with his statement of you. Then I've been on the committee longer than anyone in Congress, and I don't think we have ever heard such a compliment before this committee of someone who works in an agency or a bureaucrat. No offense. So it's a rare occasion. I may need medical treatment.
So two, record-shattering events have occurred, Mr. Throckmorton, here. One is a Republican chairman has said, do you have enough money? Do you need more? And secondly, a Georgian Republican is praising, a Federal official. I'm telling you, run to the bank.
Well, again, we end on sort of a light and positive note, which is good. But again, this series of hearings is to review some important questions. Our subcommittee in particular has jurisdiction over state-federal relations and conflicts and laws. And I think, again, we'll be having another hearing in July. And I thank each of our witnesses. I thank the members who have participated. There being no further business before the Government Operations Subcommittee, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, John. Very useful.